warm welcome to our fourth episode and actually our last episode in our Lunch and Learn series for this quarter. I'll be introducing you again to Sean Piggott from Icon shortly in terms of today's episode, which will be when to make a switch or making the switch into contracting, which will be a very interactive and informative session. Again, it'll be more, I suppose, opinionated from Sean, really not an exact science, but we'll go through a few pointers. But before we kick off, again, a warm welcome to everyone. And just to point out, I suppose, some housekeeping today in terms of if any questions. It's not interactive, so what we'll do is we'll answer questions at the end. So if you can use the Q&A function attached to your Zoom function there, we will try to get to everyone's question at the end. I'm sure we will, and we'll do our best to answer them. So again, thanks to Sean for attending. I'll pop you over shortly. And just one final thing, Sean, before you come in. In terms of the 4 episodes, guys, you can reach and view all the episodes on our YouTube channel. And if you're struggling to find that, you can reach out to us in Berkeley here or our website, which will have a link and a pop-in link to these 4 episodes, So that's it. So over to you, Sean.
Excellent. Thanks a million, Tony, for the intro. I'm just going to share my screen, guys, and we'll have a quick look, I suppose, at what the agenda is. As Tony touched on, there's no exact science, or I suppose there's no exact correct path into contracting, or I suppose an exact guide as to what you should follow. Obviously, your own personal circumstances will come into it as well. But for the purposes of today in the agenda, we're going to look at, first and foremost, what is contracting. So kind of a definition of what contracting actually is. Reasons to consider the switch into a contract opportunity should you be, I suppose, presented with an opportunity. What to be aware of in the contracting kind of, I suppose, environment and the world of contract, and what would you not be aware of from a permanent employment position that you need to become aware of if you are considering a contract role. To follow up on that, then what to take advantage of if you do decide to obviously pursue that opportunity. Other benefits to kind of keep in mind, common myths also to kind of, I suppose, address them and put a little bit of factual behind it. A quick summary, and then obviously, as Tony touched on, we'll also make sure we make time to answer all of the questions that you do have. So again, if anyone has any questions throughout the kind of slideshow or the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll make sure we leave some time at the end. So to kind of kick off, we'll have a look at a definition of what is contracting. So contracting, first and foremost, has become increasingly popular since kind of 2008. And again, it was popular in the UK and the United States and even in Australia before that, but it only really took off in Ireland around the kind of period of the economic downturn. Since then, it's kind of witnessed double-digit growth year on year, so at least kind of 10 to 15, even 20% growth on a yearly basis, essentially since 2008, and it's still showing that growth now. So it is definitely becoming a more and more common method of employment or method of engaging with talent, essentially. So a contracting role or a contracting job typically recognizes the worker as a self-employed individual. And the difference between a permanent employment contract and a contract for services, essentially, is that you are going to provide services to a company. You're not going to essentially be employed by that company. And what typically, I suppose, differentiates the two contracts is essentially you will have a contract for services document, and in that contract for services document, it'll outline the duration of your contract, the scope of the services agreed, and typically an hourly or daily rate. Now, not every contract will have an hourly or daily rate. Some will have a monthly rate, or some will have different, I suppose, payments. But the main thing to kind of take from this is that in your contract for services, you will agree on what activities or what services or what consultancy you're going to provide to your end-term client, essentially. And outside of that scope is not for your concern, essentially. If you're an employee, obviously, you can kind of be dragged in and the lines can get a little bit crossed at times. On a contract for services basis, it's very, very clear and very definitive in terms of what you're coming into that company to actually do, or what you're going to provide for the actual end-term client. So why would people consider to switch into a contracting opportunity? The most common examples that we come across, and obviously we speak to many contractors that are considering their first contract opportunity, so they're probably not contractors at that stage, but many candidates that are considering a contract opportunity for the first time, they're typically, I suppose, more in line with what permanent employment is, and more, I suppose, familiar with what permanent employment is. The first thing, and one of the most attractive things, obviously, is the contractors typically earn a higher rate of pay. So even if it's a case that you're carrying out the exact same role or duty as someone that's in a permanent employment position, typically contractors will earn anywhere between 10 and 30% higher pay than a full-time employee equivalent. Now, there are a couple of reasons as to why that additional pay is paid, and we'll touch on them in a little bit more time down the line. But that's one of the main reasons that people first and foremost will consider a contract opportunity, is because you will more than likely have a higher rate of pay than someone that's doing a permanent role in the exact same profession and carrying out the exact same roles. The other thing is the increased flexibility that is allowable in contracting and has been recognised, and it's been something that's been widespread across the contracting industry since 2008, like I say. Obviously, more and more organisations now are starting to bring that flexibility into their permanent workforce as well, as a result of COVID and working from home. So I suppose in terms of being an advantage of contracting versus permanent, this used to be an awful lot bigger than what it is now, because there is that element of flexibility coming into the permanent side of employment too. But there is also many independent professionals out there that will still decide to work your traditional 9 to 5 hours. Others will work the equivalent of the 9 to 5, but it could be from 8 to 4, it could be from 7 to 3. Essentially, they'll have an increased amount of flexibility in terms of when they work, how they work, and also where they carry out that work as well. Another reason, I suppose, to consider the switch is the increased tax efficiency. And as Tony touched on, it's something that we have spent a little bit of time on in the previous episodes of the Lunch and Learn. So it's definitely something that if you are considering a contract opportunity to go back and catch up on, is the ability to the likes of claim business expenses. It's always been a major selling point for contract roles. It's obviously not something that you can do if you're a permanent employee within a role. It can vary, obviously, in terms of what expenses are going to be applicable to your actual role. But the likes of a small benefit exemption scheme, to the likes of utility bills if you are working from home, and obviously even the likes of mileage and subsistence, essentially. So there's definitely an ability to become not only have an increased rate of pay essentially at the top line. There's also an ability then obviously to make sure that you're increasing your tax efficiency alongside your higher rate of pay, which eventually should obviously lead into an increased net pay for you or take home pay. Exposure is a massive thing, essentially, when you're considering a contract opportunity. The biggest benefit, in my opinion, obviously the rate of pay is one thing and the increased tax efficiency is another. But if you're someone that's considering obviously going off and I suppose expanding on your career or going into professional development and really kind of nailing down expertise that will kind of consider you as an expert within your field, contracting is definitely something that you should at least consider. And the reason I would say it is if it's a case that you're in a permanent employment scenario, it's very unlikely, just based on the, I suppose, you can use any organization as an example in this scenario, but if you're a permanent employee, it's very unlikely that you'll be deciding which projects you work on and which opportunities you want to kind of, I suppose, spend time on. It's more likely the case where there's a task in front of you, we have to get it done regardless of what your kind of personal feelings are towards that task. In contracting, it's quite the opposite. You can pick and choose which opportunities you're most interested in, and you can obviously target them accordingly. So if it's a case that you're really interested in one aspect of Java development, or if it's a case that you're really interested in one side of life sciences, you can really, really push into, I suppose, becoming an expert in that field. And again, obviously developing your skill set within a specific area. So exposure to actual skills, expertise, and also opportunities is something that you can definitely double down on within the contracting market in comparison to obviously if you're working as a permanent employee. BYOB is not bring your own beer in this aspect, unfortunately, but it is become your own boss. So you do have, again, that kind of aspect where you are working as an independent professional. It will give you the opportunity to become your own boss. Some contracts obviously will be a little bit more rigid than others. So again, for example, I touched on an example in the previous slide saying that a lot of independent professionals will work from 7 to 3 instead of the typical 9 to 5. In some contracts, that won't be an option. It won't be as, I suppose, flexible, but there will be flexibility in other areas that you can take advantage of. Essentially, the main kind of aspect of become your own boss, and the main benefit to me in become your own boss is not only are you obviously creating and developing your own skill set and developing a niche skill set, hopefully, it's also a case that you're building out your own brand. And again, that's something that contracting really gives you an opportunity to do, is to become your own boss, build your own brand. And again, you'll also have the added flexibility of deciding where you work, how you work, and also when you work. Again, there will be some limitations depending on obviously the kind of different tax structures that need to be taken into account. But in the vast majority of cases, it is possible to become your own boss and essentially to act like you're your own boss as well in the vast majority of contracts. Just, I suppose, before we do go on, I wanted to give everyone kind of an idea as to, well, what does a contractor look like? The answer is a contractor can look like anyone. It can be someone that's just graduated out of college. It can be someone that's actually already retired, that's looking to kind of come back into the workforce. There's no there's no kind of, I suppose, set sample as to what a contractor should look like. There are some kind of common traits and skills essentially that I would always align with contractors. So there on screen, you can see them in front of you. They're typically financially driven. They're typically highly skilled and qualified. They're normally self-starter and self-dependence. They do normally have some aspect of networking abilities. They like flexibility and adaptability, but they're also flexible and adaptable. Again, they do have experience. So when you look at a graduate, it may not be a case that you have experience in the working world, but you may be very experienced in a particular, obviously a particular subject that you've studied. You're highly motivated. You do have confidence in your abilities. You're good in terms of interpersonal skills. And obviously, if you're already kind of acting as a sole trader, an entrepreneur in some aspect, becoming a contractor will be an absolute walk in the park for you. So this slide was just about kind of, if you see any of these skills or traits and you see them within yourself, definitely, again, I would, I suppose, recommend looking into a contract opportunity, or if contracting is something that you've been considering and you see a couple of skills or a couple of traits on the screen that you would also align with yourself, definitely look into it in a little bit more detail and definitely, I suppose, investigate it further as to whether you should be looking at contract opportunities rather than just permanent. Again, to kind of follow on from the previous slide, this slide is all about kind of the natural progression and how seamless it can be, obviously, to switch from a permanent opportunity across into the world of contracting. So there are a couple of changes that will, I suppose, take place when you become a contractor and independent professional. First and foremost, you're going to be responsible for invoicing for your time worked. You are going to potentially look at the class PRSI change. So again, you do have a couple of options available to you. If it's a case that you would like to still be seen as an employee and recognized as an employee, there is a PAYE umbrella solution available to you, so that's what you can see on the screen now. Some people will opt for that just as an entry route into the contracting world, because again, it's something that they're familiar with. It's something they want to cling on to in terms of, again, being a like for like in terms of what they've experienced throughout their permanent employment time. The most popular, to be 100% honest, is the director umbrella. And I suppose you can see that on the screen now. So some people will start in the POE, transition across to a director umbrella, and then they'll make a final transition that we'll get to in another couple of moments. Others, and the most common, to be honest, is essentially that people will go for the director umbrella straight away. And the main reason for that is because you have the opportunity to become more tax efficient through this solution than you do in the POE umbrella. But what I would say to you is, if it's a case that you're considering contracting, there is always a medicine for any kind of concern that you have. There's always, I suppose, another option, or there's always something that we can provide that will nullify any concerns you have. Finally, when someone has, I suppose, taken the plunge into contracting, they've got a taste for it, they've maybe completed their first contract, their contract is now being extended, or they're looking at other contract opportunities, essentially, that's when they'll make the transition into the private limited company. And then, again, that's something that we discussed in one of the previous Lunch and Learn sessions that you can catch up on. In the likes of a private limited company, that's when you can start looking at the likes of, okay, well, am I going to invest my funds into property? Am I going to purchase a company vehicle? And again, there's a little bit more to it in terms of whether you want to hire employees and really flesh out your brand. So the most natural progression into contracting, I would say, is first and foremost the umbrella company. That makes life very, very easy for you, very, very straightforward. And then you can progress into the personal limited company. We're also going to have a look at a couple of things to be aware of, obviously, before you do decide to make the switch, or before you do decide to look into it a little bit more. Is the first one I would touch on is the contracting certainly isn't for everyone. It is definitely booming. It's booming from both sides of the market at the moment. So what I would say is that it's becoming increasingly popular with the likes of the 21st century employee, or the 21st century worker, we should call them now. And it's also becoming increasingly popular from hiring clients' perspective. And there's multiple reasons as to why that's happening, but I would also turn around and say that it's certainly not for everyone. And I'm going to go through a couple of reasons as to why that may be the case. Firstly, independent professionals get paid for the time that they physically work. So therefore, we touched on the fact that you might have a higher daily or hourly rate as part of obviously becoming an independent professional versus someone that's a typical employee or working in a full-time employment scenario. You should take this into account, essentially, that you only get paid for the time you physically work. So the likes of your holiday pay, the likes of sick pay, they're not included when you're, I suppose, operating as an independent professional. So that 10 to 30%, depending on obviously what side of the scale you're on with regards to the rate of pay, has to account obviously for holidays. And obviously we can provide calculations to anyone that is interested, essentially. But it's definitely something you should be aware of. If you're looking at a contract role and you're thinking, right, I can earn so much more by going with a contract role here, it's something to note is that you have to take into account you're only going to get paid for the time that you physically work as an independent professional contractor, whereas as an employee, obviously, you may have sick pay built into your contract, and you'll also have the likes of your holiday allowance. So very important to do them calculations before obviously jumping into a role. The third point I'd make on this is that having a trusted provider manage your compliance essentially makes the transition from permanent employment to contracting so much more seamless. The reason being is, again, there's an awful lot of things that's going to be discussed with you when you're, I suppose, considering your first contract opportunity. The first of which is that you're going to require a private limited company structure. The next thing you're going to be spoken to about by the recruiter or the company is you're going to need to look after your invoicing. This is how we do our invoicing. This is how you need to basically provide your compliance certificates. You need to provide VAT registration. So there's an awful lot of things happening, and it can happen quite quickly, obviously, with regards to the turnaround of your start date. What I would say is if you're with someone that's a dedicated contractor's accountant, essentially, there's plenty of them out in the market. Obviously, Icon Accountant are one as well. But what I would say is they will make it very, very streamlined in terms of bringing you into your first contract role, making sure you have everything that you need. And although maybe your first contract opportunity, the dedicated contractor's accountant obviously has onboarded many people in your scenario. So again, feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to obviously ask for assistance and guidance. And again, it will make that process of making the transition an awful lot more straightforward and a lot less stressful on your behalf. If you're trying to do everything yourself, if you're trying to set up a company in the background on your own, as well as obviously trying to get everything done before your start date, it can become a little bit stressful. And again, there's an awful lot that's being asked of you, and there's an awful lot of change happening at once. So I would recommend reaching out and getting, I suppose, a little bit of assistance at the start, and then you can progress into your own company if that's what you are hoping to do. Another couple of things is that your PRSI class may change. So what do I mean by PRSI class? Essentially, from the tax code revenue, there's a couple of different PRSI classes out there. So if you are a typical standard employee, full-time employee, you're more than likely going to be on PRSI Class A. So that basically means that your contributions are paid for on your behalf of your employer. They make sure all your taxes are paid, etc. If you move to self-employed, your PRSI class could become Class S. And as a result of that change, again, there's a couple of things to take into account. So for one, I suppose it was actually updated in the last couple of years where Class S PRSI does now make contributions to the job seekers benefit, whereas from 2008 up until 2017, I'm really sure, it was a case that if you were to be operating as Class S, you weren't making any contributions to the job seekers benefit. So if, touch wood, worst scenario, or I suppose the worst scenario comes to the forefront and you find yourself out of a job, it can obviously cause a lot of difficulty and a lot of stress. That has since been changed. However, there are other social welfare entitlements that you don't contribute to as a result of switching to Class S, one of which is the illness benefit. Now, again, I touched on it in the last slide, there's always essentially a medicine for any concern that you have. Someone has thought about, obviously, this as the boom has happened throughout contracting since 2008. So what I would say to someone that has that concern is you can get income protection policies in place. The income protection policy can actually safeguard up to 75% of your income, whereas obviously the illness benefit will only look after €203 per week. So again, something to be aware of, not something to put you off, but definitely something that you should be aware of before you accept a contract opportunity. The other thing I would say is you will need to network more than a full-time employee if you want to become a career contractor. Now, again, it's not necessarily relevant. I suppose it's not relevant to every single independent professional contractor out there, because I would always recommend, and my advice to anyone that's considering a contract opportunity is, like most things in life, what you put in is what you'll get out. So if you go out there and I suppose try and really make a name for yourself in terms of I'm acting and I'm representing my own brand, in that scenario, you're more than likely going to put your all into your contract role. You're not going to turn around and again kind of take your foot off the gas. You will have a lot more kind of flexibility in terms of you're not going to be directly managed. You're not going to have someone supervising you at all times. Instead, you're expected to kind of have the skill set, come in and deliver on what the contract for services outlines. So I would say that if it's a case that you're looking to become a career contractor, you will need to network more. You will need to build relationships with your end-term client, with your recruitment agency that you're engaging with, and it's definitely worthwhile doing so. So if you're currently a contractor with Berkeley, make sure you build and keep that relationship intact, essentially, because the guys will always have obviously other opportunities coming up, and they'll do their very best, obviously, to make you fit into one of the upcoming projects. In saying that, again, if you don't represent yourself very well, if you don't obviously carry yourself with professionalism, integrity and everything else, it's a case that you're more than likely not going to get them opportunities when your current contract expires. So again, a little bit of common sense being applied. You need to, again, remember you are representing your own brand and act accordingly, essentially, just so you can guarantee the future opportunities do land on your doorstep. And I touched on this one just slightly. Focus just is on the output. So the focus as an independent professional is always on the output. When you're working as an independent professional contractor, you're expected to hit the ground running almost. So you're expected to deliver and be capable of doing so from the very offset. Training can be provided, and training will be provided, obviously, in terms of any internal systems that you need to, I suppose, become familiar with or become aware of. However, your skill set is what essentially is what's being, I suppose, brought into the company, and I suppose what the client is actually looking for is that specific skill set. So that skill set should already be developed to the required level, essentially, to complete the work that has been outlined again in that contract for services. So just keep that in mind, is that you're always developing, you're always learning, essentially. The next point I would move on to, essentially, is things that you should take advantage of during your contract opportunity. And the first of which I would touch on is essentially the ability to upskill, cross-skill, and upskill again. Again, if we move back to that career contractor example, professional development is obviously something that you need to kind of keep in your, I suppose, on your horizon and on your plan. It's something that's changing, obviously, very, very quickly. If you're in technology, it's constantly changing. Again, life sciences, regardless of which market you're actually, I suppose, operating through, it is a case that, again, you do need to consistently upskill, cross-skill, and again, even upskill again. So what I would say to you is, if you are considering an independent professional opportunity, the beauty of it is that when you are actually taking on these upskills or cross skills, it is a business expense for an independent professional. So unlike that of a permanent employee, you're going to have to pay that, I suppose, after your taxes paid. You're going to have to look at, I suppose, progressing yourself otherwise. If it's a case that you're an independent professional, it can be classed as a business expense, which again helps your tax efficiency and make sure that you retain more of your income. But it does also mean that the skills that you're picking up along the way will also increase your rate of pay, essentially, as well. So definitely something to consider. And if it's something that you're looking to kind of zone in on in terms of becoming an expert within a particular field, contracting is definitely something for you. The other piece I would look at, apologies, I think my microphone may have just changed slightly, but again, I hope everyone can still hear me. Another thing I would say is that you can obviously take advantage of the likes of executive pensions. Income protection was something I touched on in the last slide, and as well as that, there's other tax efficiencies to take advantage of. The executive pension piece, the only difference between an executive pension and your standard pension essentially is that there's more tax relief applicable to an executive pension. So definitely, if it's a case that you find yourself operating as a director in an umbrella or as a director of your own personal limited company, you should be looking at an executive pension. The other side that we looked at, I suppose, earlier in the slideshow was that, again, if you're going to change your class of PRSI contributions, so if you change from class A to class S, the social welfare benefit of the illness benefit is something that you're no longer going to be contributing to through them class S PRSI contributions. So income protection is something that you should consider. And again, the beauty of the income protection policy is that it's tax efficient, but it's also going to safeguard up to 75% of your income. Whereas obviously the illness benefit at the moment is going to cover about €203 per week as a maximum. So what I would also say then, in terms of, I suppose, just to kind of finalize what else to take advantage of, is the additional value offerings. So service providers in the market now essentially are offering more and more value in terms of what kind of a package they're offering. It's not just the case that your service provider is now looking after tax and compliance. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more kind of features coming to the market, and it's something you should definitely take advantage of. So in Icon Accounting, we have iPerks. We also have a dedicated wealth management partner. So what that means is essentially if we have a client that's concerned about a mortgage or they're in the process of applying for a mortgage, they have a dedicated wealth management partner essentially that they can reach out to, they can have a consultation with, and they can give them the true kind of facts and figures essentially as to what needs to happen in order to, first and foremost, get that mortgage approval, and then obviously how they need to draw it down. The other side of it is the likes of iPerks that we have at Icon Accounting. That gives all of our clients access to a savings platform. So there's thousands of retailers essentially on there. Circle K is personally my favorite, obviously with the rise in fuel prices. So I've taken advantage of that one most recently. But as well as that, there's also up to 4,000 professional courses essentially that all of our clients have access to through their Icon Accounting app and portal. So like I say, that's just one of, I suppose, the features, essentially one of the value offerings that are in the background. But have that conversation essentially with your provider in terms of what other value offerings are in the background and what's available to them. The other side I would touch on is the relief and expenses. It's something that we touched on last week in our Lunch and Learn 3 session, which was the entrepreneurial relief and retirement relief. Again, if you're not familiar with them, definitely catch up on the recorded episodes that you'll find on the Berkeley YouTube channel. And it's something that you should definitely take into account if you're considering a contract opportunity. Obviously, you can also claim business expenses, and we've touched on that a little bit, but the main benefit to me is the entrepreneurial relief, something that's very achievable for anyone essentially that's out there considering their first contract role. So definitely recommend going and catching up on that one. And the final point to make on in terms of what to take advantage of if you are considering a contract opportunity is the fact that you will be able to control the outcome. So again, if you're looking to really kind of zone in on a particular area, become an expert and provide a skill set that's very, very rare, it's a very niche skill set to have. Again, the contracting market is definitely something you should consider. It gives you the opportunity to learn and to deliver, but also to develop your own personal brand. And like I touched on before, it's a case where, like most things in life, what you put in is what you'll get out as well. So common myths, despite the fact that there is an end date for 90%, despite the fact there's an end date for every single contract out there, I would say that almost 90% of contract roles are extended, or again, it's a case where there's a new opportunity to kind of present itself within the same organization or within a different organization. It is a case that I suppose one of the main kind of concerns that people do come to us with is the longevity sense of it. So if it's a case where I suppose you're more familiar with working as a full-time employee, there's no expiration date. You know, it's a case where you get your job, you're in your job, and unless you do something kind of terrible or decide to leave, it's a case where you're going to have that job for the foreseeable. If you go into a contract, it is a different mindset that you need to have. It's a case where initially it could be a 3-month contract, it could be a 6-month contract, and essentially you're almost trying to prove yourself essentially throughout that contract journey. Again, like I say, 90% of the contracts will be extended. So it will be a case that your 6 months becomes 12 months, and 12 months can even become 24 months. But the beauty of it is that you do still have the control aspect in the background. So if it's a case that you're actually not enjoying the contract that you're currently on, or you're not enjoying the project that you're currently working on, you do have the ability to obviously look elsewhere, to kind of, I suppose, zone in on a different area and try something else out. The one thing I would touch on here is that if COVID-19 taught us anything in terms of the pandemic and everything obviously that happened, is that contractors are no longer the first to go in times of uncertainty. And the reason for that is because there's been a bit of a mindset shift from an employer perspective as well in terms of hiring clients. And an awful lot of the time, your hiring client now understands essentially that contractors typically have sorry guys, my headset has just gone on me typically. Just want to make sure I have the same.
We can still hear you, Sean, yeah.
Hear me, Tony, perfect. So what I would say is that if COVID taught us anything, like I touched on, it's the contractors are no longer the first to go. Hiring clients are recognizing that essentially a lot of the time the independent professionals that they're engaging with have very, very niche skill sets. So I personally wouldn't be too concerned about the job security aspect, and instead I'd look at the opportunity that can arise from operating as an independent professional. Independent professionals can't get a mortgage is another one that we come across quite often. Again, it's understandable, obviously, that people are very, very concerned about this when they hear it. One thing I would say is it's simply not true. Again, you do need to have a sense of realism, essentially, when you're having the conversation. If you're moving from a permanent role to another permanent role, the likelihood is that that break in employment or that change in employment is going to have a little bit of a knock-on effect essentially for you in your mortgage application. It's no different in contracting. It definitely was the case, I suppose, but when you look back to 2008, when working as an independent professional was essentially very new to the Irish market, that it would be an awful lot more difficult for an independent professional to get a mortgage back in them days. Thankfully, there's now, like I say, dedicated wealth management partners essentially that are solely focused on the contracting market. And because it's become increasingly popular, the financial institutions now, obviously, that are providing the mortgages and providing the finance are also a lot more familiar with the benefits of essentially loaning and lending to an independent professional, essentially because of obviously the higher rate of pay, the higher net pay as a result of the higher tax efficiency. So what I would say to you in this scenario is if you do have any concerns about that whatsoever, please feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to set up a no obligation and a free of charge consultation with a dedicated wealth management partner that can point you in the right direction. Again, they're not going to lead you down the line essentially that's not true. They'll tell you exactly how it is and what it is based on your independent I suppose scenario and what's going on in your own I suppose life stage or what stage of the application process you're currently at. I would also, just before I move on, actually it's very important probably to touch on the fact that if it's a case that you're just at the drawdown stage of a mortgage, it's probably not the wisest decision to make a move into contracting or to make a move at all, to be 100% honest. But again, you'll have to weigh up the option and obviously the opportunity in front of you in order to make that kind of, I suppose, decision. But definitely something to consider essentially is that if you're currently at the drawdown stage, you probably don't want to make the switch straight away, but speak to your advisor and they'll be able to advise on your own particular scenario in more detail. Again, one of, I suppose, the final myths that we do come across when it comes to people that are kind of interested in a contract opportunity for the first time is that they feel like they're going to be flying solo. So they feel like that they're going to be now responsible for all of this stuff that was kind of taken care of in the background in a permanent employment opportunity. So the likes of invoicing, well, I've never had to invoice for my work before. I've just had to turn up, do my work, and I've got paid on a weekly or monthly basis. This way, in the contracting world, it's going to be slightly different. You're going to bill for the number of hours or the number of days that you work as part of that, essentially. And again, it goes back to the advice I would give in terms of making sure that you partner yourself with a dedicated service provider that can, again, assist and guide you along this journey. You will have the likes of your taxation to pay. So instead of it being a case that you get paid your net amount into your bank account, instead, when you're contracting, you're going to get paid for your invoice, and then essentially all of the taxes have to be deducted from that invoice. So there is definitely a little bit more to contracting. There's another couple of steps. There's another couple of things that you have to think about. But again, if you position yourself correctly, if you again take a step back and I suppose have a plan in place that you're going to offload 90% of the work to a dedicated partner, it means that you can focus on obviously what you do best, which is the skill set that you're being essentially hired or engaged with for. Again, there's no benefits with contracting. That's, I suppose, one of the last points I would make in this. The likes of healthcare, the likes of your pension contributions and free fruit. It's something that I suppose is becoming more and more common in the workplace now. We've heard all of these, I suppose, benefits that people have been offered and people, I suppose, currently have in their permanent employment. But there's always a way to get the exact same benefits that your permanent role offers, or you'll have the additional income to pay for it. So again, what I would say there is, if it's a case that you currently don't have, or sorry, your employer essentially looks after your healthcare plan for you, so you get private healthcare as part of it. Again, one of the conversations and the reason that the calculations are so important from the very offset is that additional 10 to 30% pay can also obviously cover the cost of your healthcare, and you should still have obviously some change at the end with regards to making sure that you are on a higher rate of pay as a result of going down the contracting route. My summary, just to give you top 4 tips essentially in terms of what I would advise anyone that is considering a contract opportunity or is considering making the switch from a permanent role into a contracting opportunity, is do your research first on the salary, day or hour rate. So again, if it's a case that you're carrying out a role as a permanent employee, what's the salary as a permanent employee going to be? And then also look at, well, what does the day rate offer, or what does the hourly rate offer, and see if there's much of a difference between employee and obviously your contractor. Again, I would say reach out to a dedicated provider for independent professional contractors such as ourselves. We'll be able to provide you with essentially bespoke calculations based on your own tax scenario, your own tax credits, and give you a very, very detailed breakdown as to what your net payment will look like at the end of the month, should you accept a role for X per hour or X per day. If you're still in doubt essentially as to what's the best route for you to take, sit down and do a SWOT analysis. It's my go-to, always has been my go-to, and it will remain to be my go-to. You can sit down, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats from permanent side, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats from the contracting side. And very quickly, you'll soon figure out which, I suppose, is becoming which is more of an opportunity for you, which is more of a threat, and weigh up the difference between the two. And my biggest tip to anyone that's considering their first contract opportunity at this moment in time, based on the market and the growth within the market over the last decade and beyond, is essentially don't worry about the longevity, think about the opportunity, because at this moment in time, there's so many more contract roles out there than there are contractors. It's a very exciting time to be in the market. And typically what you will find, if you look at the market, I suppose in terms of the contractor market, it's typically the emerging markets that have the most contract opportunities as well. So it's something to be excited about rather than be wary about. But I do also understand that everyone has their own personal circumstances in the background. So reach out, have the conversation, and weigh up the options would be my, I suppose, advice on that scenario. Hopefully we've got a couple of questions in, Tony. I think we do.
Yeah, Sean. Yeah, listen, thanks again. Excellent detail as always. I think just to touch upon some excellent tips, but I think, as you said, just to guide more pros and cons. Of course, it's not exact science, as we said initially, but there's definitely a good guide there if you were looking at contracting, or indeed if you're contacted by your recruitment partners, hopefully Berkeley, in terms of an opportunity to go contracting, and there's some good guides and tips there to what to look out for, you know. So there is some good interest coming in as always, and Couple of tricky ones for you straight off the bat. I think you'd be happy. Just a question there from Derek, who has an opportunity of taking up a contract working for a facility based in Denmark. That would be 90% based at home, which is common now in terms of the current hybrid model for a lot of opportunities, with intermittent travel to site. His question is around taxation. Would he have to pay Danish or Irish tax or both? And to make things more complicated, the company, the subcontracting agency consultancy will be based in England, of course. So a few tricky things there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I suppose the first thing to take into account when you're weighing up any kind of scenario like that is, where am I physically going to be? So as you touched on, Tony, it seems like 90% of the role is going to be carried out in Ireland. At this moment in time, to me, it sounds like you're an Irish tax resident. Obviously, it depends if you've been anywhere in the last 12 months or if you've just returned to Ireland. That's a different conversation. But at this moment in time, you'd be considered an Irish tax resident, unless you're going to spend 183 days in Denmark carrying out the role, which doesn't seem to be the case in what's been provided. You're going to remain an Irish tax resident. But again, my advice would be essentially check in with a local tax advisor in Denmark just to make sure that the rules are similar to that of Ireland. I know in Ireland, for example, if it was the reverse and it was a Danish contractor looking to essentially be in Ireland for a certain period of time, but 90% was going to be operated through Denmark, it would be a case that as long as you don't surpass 60 days, essentially, you'd be more than covered essentially to continue paying Irish tax.
That would be out of the 10%, is what Derek's saying, that would be 60 days over the initial duration. I mean, is it? It couldn't go over.
Exactly. So just kind of see what the local guidelines are. I know in the UK it's a little bit different. So it will vary from country to country essentially, but you are definitely an Irish tax resident, so your tax should be paid in Ireland. It's just whether essentially if you surpass a certain number of days.
Over a period of time, which is it's fair enough. I think it's clear and evident, really, Derek, I'd say at that stage. It's one, just before we came on here, actually, we were getting our hair and makeup done, something we touched upon actually, Sean, in terms of actually the Nordics. Remember, it was something we just spoke about. It definitely is breaking down where you're going to be based for the duration. Not, I think it's one of those ones, Derek, you just have to weigh out, is it definitely 90% in Ireland, or are you going to be required to say? I think that's what they'd look at if you were investigated, It's one we'd be fairly comfortable on, Derek, we could take offline if you want to reach out to myself and Sean on after this webinar, or set up a consultation to explore further. If you have other questions, Derek, we can kind of maybe have a deeper conversation on it. But it's definitely, Sean, where you're based and then those days. If it's 60 days, sorry, you said, is it?
60 days from an Irish perspective, if it was to be the opposite. So again, I'd be more than happy to reach out to a contact that we'd have in Denmark as well in that scenario, just to assist to make sure that it's similar. But if I was giving someone essentially a solution out of the bottle, there is just check in with a local tax advisor in whatever country it's going to be, but where you're physically based for the vast majority of the role essentially is where you're going to be paying your taxes.
No, they'd be correct in saying it's probably relevant if the company, the subcontracting vehicle agency is in England, because it's going to be anyway just based in Denmark, really, isn't it?
Exactly. So to be honest with you, regardless of where
Europe, because it doesn't really come into the context, really. It's just the actual contract itself being in Denmark, isn't it?
Exactly, and where the work is physically being carried out. So regardless of where the intermediary is essentially, or the recruitment partner, it's more where you are and where you're going to be physically carrying out the work.
Yeah, very good. Thanks for that. As I said, Derek, if that doesn't hit the nail on the head, you might reach out to me directly. I can set up a three-way shot if you don't mind, or you
Absolutely.
can list of both of us. Yeah. Thanks for that. There's a couple of them coming in here from Sean, Liam and Tracy. Similar kind of question. If you're coming into contracting for the first time, I think you gave a guide there, 15 to 30%, I think it was. Where does that start or stop? Is it different per industry? Is it different per level? How do you guide it if, let's just say, Berkeley called you, there's a contracting role, and you're in a perm role, do you go straight 30% on top of what the salary is, or what's the tip?
I would say again, without hopefully making you fall out with me, Tony, I'd say the first thing to do is to make sure, obviously, that you're being realistic. So if it's a case that you're in kind of a mid to, I suppose, entry level role, essentially, I'd be definitely looking at the lower end of that scale. Right. If it's a case that your skill set is one that's very, very sought after and very, very rare in the country, then you're going to be looking at the higher end of the kind of 30% essentially. And again, it all comes down to the kind of supply and demand. If it's a case that you've got a skill set that's very, very niche, you're automatically looking at the higher end of that scale. If it's a case that you're going into a market that's quite populated and there's an awful lot of people out there with the skills, make sure you remain realistic essentially with what your own skill set brings to the table.
Yeah, no, listen, we never follow Sean, you know that. But in terms of, and we'd recommend, I think that would be our guide initially. And I think it's knowing your worth. I think you said that, but I think definitely your recruitment partner there will help and judge you, you know. I think definitely it's that partnership approach for us, really, and our consultants that will guide a person if they're coming into contracting association with the with yourselves, you know, in terms of the partners, you know, just to advise what that rate should look like and make sure you're comfortable in terms of your cost of living, of course, as well.
Absolutely.
If you're stepping up, things change. Just another question in terms of illness benefit. Again, you kind of touched upon it. So probably the stage of where you're at as well in your life in terms of what you're looking for PAYE, umbrella and private. Is there any guide? I know it's a personal preference again, but it's just the...
It's definitely, like you say, Tony, definitely a personal preference. And again, I wouldn't like to give kind of an out of the box solution to everyone in that scenario. But at the same time, if I was to answer that question, look, if it's a case where you feel young, fit and healthy, you're less likely to be concerned about it in the first place, to be honest. And it's not something that we come across quite often when we're speaking to candidates that are kind of considering their first contract role. But when you do speak to some, again, our whole concept of contracting and the reason that we, again, are so confident about contracting is that transparency is so important for us. So it's something that we would mention to everyone. Look, this is something to be aware of. It's not something to put you off. There is, I suppose, other vehicles that can bring you to the same location essentially and give you that same sense of security. But we'd rather you know from the offset. We don't want you to come back to us in a year's time and say, oh, well, I didn't realize my class PRSI was going to change, or I didn't realize I wasn't going to be making contributions to the illness benefit. So for that reason, I would say, think about it. Think about, again, okay, is the additional rate of pay that I'm being offered going to be able to cover an income protection policy? The income protection policy that I'm going to take out is actually going to put me in a better position than my Class A PRSI contributions were anyway. And again, if it's a case that you don't want to lose the Class A PRSI contributions, there's also another solution there available. So case by case basis, but I would say look at income protection, look at how much it's going to cost you. And then obviously make the kind of judgment based on whether your higher rate of pay is going to allow you to still have more at the end of the month with your income protection policy looked after as well.
Great. Yeah. This is someone actually coming from a niche skill set area, but if you're confident in terms of knowing where you're coming from and the value, would you recommend going straight into private limited company contracting? And you just touched upon it there as opposed to PAYE.
Again, absolutely. I'd suggest, again, okay, so first and foremost, it's going to take between 6 and 8 weeks to get a private limited company set up, which is painful, to be honest, but it will essentially take that long. So if your opportunity is starting in 3 months' time, then by all means, go straight into the private limited company. If it's a case that you need something a little bit quicker, I would say go into a director umbrella company straight away, set up your private limited company as well in the background, which obviously your provider can look after and manage for you. And then when your company is ready, you'll make that transition across. What that will do is it will just mean that as you're kind of coming to grips with your new opportunity, there'll be someone else essentially looking after invoicing, there'll be someone else looking after payroll, and it'll allow you to kind of actually focus on getting your head in the door, getting yourself to work essentially, and making sure that everyone's happy from a performance perspective. You don't have to worry about taxation or compliance at that stage, and then you can transition across once you've got everything under control.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And again, personal preferences and what you're kind of looking at that stage.
100%.
This is one for both of us, Sean. They're pushing us here, you know. You mentioned a boom in 2008. Does Berkeley or Icon see any trends and variances in contracting, or is there any concerns for us? Is there a bottoming out of the market? Is there an implosion? I don't think they're being negative, but it's a fair question. It's something the consultants get asked all the time, you know. And if there's a concern coming in, you know, should they look ahead?
Icon Accountants perspective, I would say that the trend prior essentially to even last year was that in times of economic uncertainty, it's a case where contracting will always boom. It'll essentially have time of uncertainty throughout the economy. If it's a case that the economy is stable and there's no kind of uncertainty out there, contract roles will tend to, or have tended to kind of, I suppose, decrease, reduce. Again, they're not going to go away. They never will go away because there'll always be that skills gap that's currently in place. So I would say that it's not something to be concerned about. It's not something to essentially, I suppose, completely kind of have a plan in stone in place. Instead, I would say turn around and kind of assess the market, contracting at this moment in time is in a very, very healthy scenario. And even when there is times of no economic uncertainty, so when everything is going smoothly, there's still been that significant growth. Typically before that, I would say that in times of economic uncertainty, contract roles boom. But in the last kind of 5-10 years, it's been a case where there's been significant and consistent growth. So again, stay in touch with your recruitment partners. The best advice I can give you there, stay in touch with the guys at Berkeley, and they'll soon guide you as to whether, you know, a permanent opportunity is going to suit you better, or whether obviously a new contract role is going to be best for you. So that's the best advice I can give you, is stay in touch with the consultants there.
Totally agree, and keeping aware of any trends and variances, and keeping abreast of anything that's coming down the tracks. And it's something we would always have said in recruitment, Sean, is, you know, be aware of a global pandemic. That would be the only concern for us. And I suppose we did come through it when you look at COVID, you know, and the concerns were there. But I think when you look at contracting and the boom that continued, there was no real drop in the market, you know, in terms of, if you look right across the complete market space, you know. Obviously there's dips here and there in certain obvious areas, but I think if we can come through a pandemic in contracting and come out the other side and have huge opportunities, I think that says a lot, really, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it was what I was just touching on there, Tony, is that it used to be a case where times of economic uncertainty, you'd see it boom. Now it's just so kind of common in like I say, the emerging sectors, that it's almost as traditional employment at this stage, which is obviously fantastic for us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, what are the current trends? Do we see any current trends in terms of areas? Obviously, we're not going to be, you know, depending on certain areas. For us, we work across business technology, life science, and supply chain procurement. All areas seem busy. You know, no obvious trends for us really in terms of those core areas. Any obvious trends for you, Sean, on your side?
No massive trends, to be fair, Tony. Again, all positive, I suppose, in terms of the fact that there's so many opportunities out there. Completely different market if there's no opportunities and loads of talent. In Ireland, it seems to be the opposite. Don't get me wrong, we've loads of talent here too, but we've even more opportunities than we do talent. So that seems to be something that's not going to be fixed overnight. So look, I'd say it's a very opportunistic place to be at the moment, and a very positive kind of problem to have, essentially.
Yeah, well, I think we're getting a similar question across the board, but what areas are really pushing you, Sean, and pushing me today? What areas would we recommend?
I would say
business technology, that's life science and engineering, that's supply chain and procurement, that's the Berkeley stance.
I don't mean to.
Our core areas, you know, coincidentally enough.
I don't mean to copy and paste you, Tony, but look, the exact same from my side. Again, information and technology has been one that's been massive in contracting. It's probably been the main driving force behind contracting over the last decade. But in the last kind of 12, 24 months, and obviously with the consistent investment coming from pharmaceutical, life sciences, and med devices, that's a really exciting space to be in as well. So any of the above, I would say, is a very, very positive place to be at this moment in time. But yeah, copy and paste job on your answer there, Tony.
Copy and paste, yeah. I know, I think we joke, but I think we are lucky in Ireland and this side of Europe in terms of the investment in those areas we've mentioned. And we're blessed with the opportunities and the growth and investment and sites growing. Huge boom then in contract work, obviously, to facilitate projects. So we are lucky, I agree, which is good. I think it's the final question from Tony. What do you make of Eric Den Haag's appointment for United?
I'll let you answer that one, Tony.
And what advice would you give him? So I think everyone's interested in advice. Your advice is so good, Sean. What advice would you give him coming into that job?
Oh, he's not going to have a grey hair issue, is he? So that's one thing.
I would say he's going to have a lot of sick days. So you would say probably POE contracting if he's looking at an employee.
Income protection policy, absolutely. I'd be concerned about his health now. Yeah, it's a difficult place to be going, but look, it's an exciting one too, I suppose. There's no bigger club in the world, as much as I'm a Villa fan, so it doesn't benefit me or hinder me in any way, shape or form. It has to be some sort of light at the end of the tunnel for United fans, to be fair.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that. So look, that wraps up a couple of good questions there, actually. And just to point out again, as I mentioned at the start, and Sean quite rightly mentioned there, all of these episodes and our webinars will be on our Berkeley YouTube channel. And feel free to have a look, record and use and share. And some very good content there. And Sean, thanks again for your contribution over the 4 weeks. Really was illuminating. I think the detail is excellent, and it's something that we can kind of look back on. And there's been a lot of requests, as you know. I think, you know, we can share your details. Sean's details will be on our website. Obviously, the content here will be on our website and on our YouTube channel. But again, if there's anything that we maybe haven't covered in the 4 weeks, we're open to suggestions here, and we're happy to conduct another webinar, you know. This concludes our 4 in this series. We will be looking at the second part of the year and conducting another series of episodes, and we are open to suggestions, Sean, I think, are we, in terms of anything that we can add value to.
Absolutely. Thanks a million for having me as well. Much appreciated.
No problem. Yeah, thanks again. Just a couple of thank yous, Sarah, internally. Thanks to the marketing team, Robert Hawkes and Molly Forsyth, in terms of what they do behind the scenes. They make this seamless. Again, Sean, thank you and Icon for putting the detail and answering the questions and giving up your own free time and lunch. And for Gillian Buckley, our own Gillian Buckley as well. So I actually got a few messages where it was Gillian today. I think people are enjoying your synergy, Sean. I hope I didn't spoil that party today, but I think Gillian will be on hand again in our next Lunch and Learn series. So look, thanks everyone. Thanks again. Have a good afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon.